You guys all know that one person who plays either burst or consistent. All they do is blame their downfall on the fact that they don't play the other playstyle. It's always the other one is broken, I play the fair and honest class. And this is also what their tier list looks like. So I really just want to talk about this stuff more objectively. More often than not, when people have this conversation, they're injecting their bias and ego onto it. So at the start here, I'm going to talk more about the design as opposed to balance. Last week we looked at the DPS charts and it's pretty obvious that the game is poorly balanced. With the data, you can see that some classes at their maximum is lower than some classes at their 75th percentile. We'll get into balance a little bit later on in the video, but for now we're just going to take a look at playstyle and then how they interact with the game. I think everybody pretty much understands how burst and consistent work and how they're different from one another. If we look at a graph here, a straight line here, pretty close to a straight line, that's a consistent damage class because it's consistent. Meanwhile, a burst is going to be that giant spike, which is pretty much because all their damage is condensed into a few skills or in a small shorter time. I'll reference these a little bit more later. So let's start off with comparing their design. Let's talk about their damage spread. A consistent damage class is usually spread out through like 5 to 7 different skills. The majority of burst classes, however, they are generally on 3 to 4 skills. There are going to be some outliers, like Igniting Sword does use like 5, I think. When it comes to the overall playstyle, consistent classes are generally higher APM and more fast-paced. These classes often prioritize the swiftness stat, or they have something built into their class, their engraving, that give them extra movement speed or even cooldown reduction. A consistent class is going to be a bit more forgiving when it comes to whiffing your skills because your damage isn't going to be all locked into a certain skill. Since earlier we mentioned they have a bigger damage spread, missing one little skill isn't going to be a huge hit on their overall performance. On the other hand though, since you do have lower cooldowns and you have to do a lot of skills to make up that damage, you really need aggressively high uptime when you're playing a consistent class to stay competitive. Comparatively, burst classes are generally going to be a bit more slower paced in terms of pretty much everything. You generally don't have much move speed built into your class, you generally don't have much cooldown reduction, but some class engravings do change and offset that. But these are classes that generally really revolve around their identity gauge. Spec is the most common stat for burst classes. It is overall more punishing to miss skills when it comes to a burst class. This is because you need to hit that skill to gain your meter for your specialty gauge, and well, if you miss your burst, then there goes all your damage. So as a burst player, you don't really just want to full send everything right away. Sometimes it's good to just wait a moment and wait for the right pattern to actually throw down your burst. And then lastly, just a little note on positionals when it comes to each one. When it comes to consistent classes, you really do need a very high uptime on your positionals. So there will be a lot of chasing the back or front. However, when it comes to burst classes, you can choose not to positional your skills that don't do that much damage that exist to basically fill up your meter. But if you're not positioning your main burst, then you lose a lot of damage. So there is a little give and take on their difficulty when it comes to positional damage on burst or consistent. Now we can move on to how these types of playstyles interact with the bosses and their mechanics. Since the boss is not a Trixion dummy where you can just mindlessly hit at it all the time, the boss is really going to affect how much damage you do. But because of how the game is designed and how the classes are designed, things like stagger, counters, mechanics, all these kind of things affect different classes differently, so let's get into that. In the ideal scenario for a burst class, they want to push their boss to a mechanic with their burst. This is because they have high damage on the burst, and then after that they have a natural downtime of getting their cooldowns back or building up towards their next burst. So that's why it makes that the perfect scenario for them, because they're putting the boss on a cooldown time at the same time you're going on a cooldown time. Meanwhile, consistent damage classes are going to benefit more off of long fights. To stay competitive with the burst class, they need to get their damage in while the burst class is on their downtime. And I think overall in longer fights, there are more potential points of failure when it comes to burst classes because of their burst. There is a lot riding out on missing out on a couple doomsdays, as opposed to missing out on a few skills on a consistent class. When you push a boss into invincible or DR or some sort of mechanic, everybody is doing Z. So let's talk about mechanics a little bit more. There are multiple types of downtime in a boss fight, and also they affect classes differently. So if a boss goes into DR, damage reduction, classes that revolve around building a meter, generally spec classes, really benefit from this because they can still hit the boss with their low damage skills and build up their meter and gauge towards their next burst during this downtime. Every class is doing basically Z DPS at that time. A consistent class might not be getting anything out of it, but a burst class, a spec burst class, is going to be able to gain meter off that time. This also applies to small ad phases like a Kanji 2. But if the boss goes invincible or just goes off the screen, then the spec classes don't get that kind of benefit because they have nothing to hit. I should also mention there are some consistent classes that do run off meters still, so it's not just burst classes that benefit off DR. but it is pretty much every burst class while it's only a few consistent classes. But when it comes to times where you can't do any damage at all, there are some classes that still can benefit from this. Sura Breaker, for example, they can actually gain their meter by just whiffing skills. They don't have to hit anything. They can greatly benefit from no boss being on the screen. Then there are classes like Predator Slayer, and I think probably BT probably has Exhaustion too. And also there's going to be Soulfist that just have a timer after hype. They can benefit from DR and having just complete downtime where they can't attack anything because they're just waiting off their cooldown phase. And then we can also talk about staggers and counters in boss fights. While it does benefit both types of playstyles, I do think that this very much benefits burst classes more than it does consistent classes. Because when you get into that free damage situation where the boss can't move, you got rid of all the risk with being a burst class with all the reward. And you can really see this reflected into the Clown days when Sork was really seen as a very strong class, when Gates had a lot of staggers and just overall downtime for them to just pop the double meatball. And yes, that probably sounds familiar because I did just recently mention that in my last video as well, but it's still a very valid point. Though keep in mind that you don't really want to invite a bunch of burst class to a fight with a lot of stagger mechanics because they're all going to hold and they're just going to be terrorists wanted in multiple countries. Now when it comes to items, there is no doubt in my mind that Atropines, something that boosts you by giving you 30% damage in 10 seconds, benefits burst more than it does consistent. Say in the next 20 seconds, a burst in a consistent class do the exact same damage. But say a burst can do 98% of their damage in 10 seconds in that window of Atropine, they're getting a 98% efficiency of an Atropine. But for a consistent, they're going to have to do full out consistent damage throughout that 20 seconds, but they're only getting 10 seconds of the Atropine. So in that 20 seconds, they are only getting Atropine for 50% of the time, which is 50% of their damage in that 20 second window. The timing between bursts would be what would balance these two, but that is also something that is very inconsistent. So you really can't say like how much definitively better it is on a burst class than a consistent, but the overall design favors a burst. But you do only get by default 3 Atros a gate, so it's not like this is a huge game-changing thing. But I do think it's pretty undeniable. However, when it comes to support buffing, that's quite a bit different. This is something that ideally is pretty much on and off on you the entire fight. Hopefully the support doesn't die. But as a burst class, this does require you to have some sort of coordination with your support, or you're just trying to hold on and wait for their buff, and hopefully they don't heal instead. Unless it's a paladin, then GG. It's always a heal and always a buff. But the point is that a support could pop its buff during your downtime after your burst, and then you're just not benefiting off of it. So you can kind of be getting a little bit cucked if you are not timing properly with your support. On the other hand, this is where consistent class can shine because they don't really need to coordinate because they should always be doing consistent damage. So anytime a buff goes out is generally a good time for that type of playstyle. Dark Bomb's a little different because they last 20 seconds, which will overlap with the cooldown time of a burst class, meaning a consistent class has more time to catch up within that window. But a Surge Deathblade should be doing a surge every 6-10 seconds, which is their burst. That means they're going to get 2 bursts off at a Dark Bomb. There is more potential for some classes rather than others. And unlike an Atropine, but more like a support buff, not every Dark Bomb in your party is going to be decided to be thrown by you when you want to do it. So there is a chance it is thrown during your downtime. While just like a support buff, a consistent damage class is going to be able to benefit off any Dark Bomb thrown basically. Now when people try to talk about difficulty as far as being as broad as burst versus consistent, this is when you know somebody has their head completely up their own ass. Difficulty is something that is very subjective. There might be somebody out there who can't do DP motions, but for some reason why they can do the SNK pretzel motion. Everybody is just different, and what is hard for one might not be hard for somebody else is what I'm saying. Again, DB players like to argue that their spec is harder than the other spec. Both builds are extremely punishing on missing skills. RE does get a movement speed buff on their engraving when they use Surge, but in exchange, RE also has to have a higher back attack uptime because their skills and damage is spread out between multiple different skills. You are all in on Surge. 60% of your damage is Surge. Missing your back attack on your 6 or 8% damage skill isn't going to be huge. In your standard RE build, your highest damage skill is going to be 28. Meanwhile, you have a lot of skills that are sitting around 10%. Overall, since your damage is more evenly split, you are more punished for missing back attack. If you miss your Surge on Surge Blade, you're doing Z DPS. If you're missing your Surge on a RE, you just lost 22% of your damage for that cycle. They both have their own difficulties to overcome, and I know in the past I've said that I do believe RE is harder, but I don't think like the difference between the two is huge. But that is my opinion, and I'm also going to be challenging my own opinion on Deathblade. I am in the process of reviving my Deathblade, and I want to get it to at least 1580, and I want to spend a good amount of time playing both specs. because this is such a controversial class between its own community. I want to experience it firsthand. It's my challenge to myself. At the end of it, I might think RE is harder, I might think Surge is harder, but at the end of the day, it is my opinion on what they are. And that's really where a lot of this problem comes from. A lot of people take their opinion as fact, and then they also don't really play what they're trying to compare it to. They just assume it's easier because it's not what they're playing. This is where I'm going to talk about my opinion here a little bit more. I think that overall, no class really is like super hard to play on rotation wise. Like the general core of playing the classes, I don't think is that bad. And I think that's part of MMO design. They don't really want to make things too hard, too challenging to exclude people from playing it, because then your massive game won't be that massive. I personally think that Arcana is probably the peak of difficulty in the game. And it's not because it's burst consistent or anything like that, it's because of the identity and also some of the tripods. This is a class where you constantly have to think about your rotation because you're going to be drawing cards at random and you don't really want to use them all at the same time. Optimally, every card has its own preferred time to use it. This means you have to actively react to your card pulls, decide when to use it. There's also the clown card, which brings up the last card you used, so you kind of want to remember what the last card you used was. And if you are playing Empress and you're doing 4 of kind, when you have tripods that will reset it randomly on use or even just give you all your stacks back, you're going to want to actively change your rotation when those RNG things happen. This brings a lot of extra things that you have to add to your mental stack, things that you have to actively think about in the fight on top of everything else. And that is my opinion. I think Arcana is one of the hardest classes to play, but there might be people who don't have problems with any of this stuff, and that's perfectly fine. Our opinions don't have to invalidate one another. Now, if we look at parse data and we look at Ivory Tower, it is pretty obvious that burst classes do have the edge. They are occupying the higher end more so than consistent. The common consistent class up there is going to be Knight's Edge, which Soul Eater is just a strong class, which actually is the overall theme of things. Because if we look, Deathblade, Breaker, Soul Eater, War Dancer, these are all popular classes with both engravings being very high on the meters. Nobody's balancing the game ohm. But there is a little bit more to this. With everything I've discussed in this video, it shouldn't really be surprising that burst does have the edge. Because of how they interact with boss, buffs, and items, they just generally do have the potential to perform better. But on top of that, parse data is generally their preferred environment. A lot of parses is going to be a lot of farm data, and farm data is the most of Lost Ark. Bursts thrive in fast fights where things are overleveled, things are pushing mechanics very often, because they are putting consistent classes into the Sneeko chair. Consistent classes really thrive on long fights, and this is why they're a really popular class for prog. This is why they're suggested for prog. You can also see that there are some very despair looking burst classes, like Deathblow and Drizzle usually don't parse that high, and that's a balance diff, not a playstyle diff. And there is the ever constant debate of, does burst deserve to have a higher ceiling? Burst players will say yes because it has higher risk, while consistent players will say no because they get to cheap out on not having as many damage gems. Both are valid to a degree. At the end of the day, it's pretty clear that they don't have a balanced philosophy, so you are pretty much just at the mercy of whatever the devs feel like doing. But now I hope you understand a little bit more on how these classes work and interact with the game and everything that goes on in fights, and maybe fight about this topic a little bit less. But that'll be it. Thanks for watching.